There is a kind of mercy that costs everything. Not the mercy of small gestures or easy forgiveness. That kind comes cheap, wears itself thin like pennies passed hand to hand. But the mercy that demands a man surrender his safety, his reputation, his future, that mercy is rare. It comes from somewhere deep in the human architecture, from that place where instinct and conscience have fused into something inseparable. The frontier tested this distinction constantly. Out here, mercy was not a virtue discussed in church. It was a choice made alone, usually at night, usually with the knowledge that the cost would be paid in full. This is the story of a man who made that choice, and of how the consequences spiraled outward like ripples in still water, spreading across years and generations, reshaping the world around him in ways he could never have predicted. His name was Hiram Callaway, and he was a tanner. At 48 years old, Hiram was built for his work in a way that suggested God or circumstance had designed him specifically for the tanning trade. He was short and barrel-chested, his forearms thick as fence posts from decades of working hides, scraping, soaking, stretching, beating leather into submission. His hands were permanently scarred and stained, the palms cracked like old saddle leather themselves. His face bore the markers of his trade, too. A ruddy complexion burned by the chemicals he worked with, broken veins running across his nose and cheeks like a man's internal weather made visible. His sandy hair had thinned to almost nothing, and he wore it uncovered most days, his scalp burned brown by the New Mexico sun. He worked alone in a squat adobe building a mile south of the settlement, surrounded by large earthen vats and racks of hides in various stages of transformation. The smell of oak bark and lime clung to everything, to his clothes, his skin, his hair, the very air that moved around him. His wife, Martha, had died of typhus 3 years ago. They'd had no children. Now he lived with 2 dogs, both working animals, both scarred and pragmatic as Hiram himself. The tannery was moderately successful. The settlement needed leather for saddles, belts, boots, harnesses, but Hiram was not a wealthy man. He was competent and honest, a man of narrow margins. The dogs were named Cain and Abel. Hiram had named them that in some moment of dark humor years ago, though neither had proven particularly murderous toward the other. Cain was a mottled gray heeler, with one eye clouded from an old wound, still useful for herding and alerting. Abel was younger, leaner, a working dog with scars along his ribs from encounters with ranch wire and the occasional predator. They slept in the tannery at night, protecting the hides and the equipment, and during the day they accompanied Hiram to the arroyos when he went to collect bark. They were not animals that sought affection, and Hiram had not given them affection. They were tools, like everything else at the tannery, necessary, practical, and understood implicitly to have work to do. The tannery itself was a sprawling compound of function without ornament. The main building, where the large vats sat in rows, was built of adobe brick that had been formed and laid by Hiram's own hands in the years after Martha's death. It had a single large window facing north, designed to keep the worst of the afternoon heat off the workspace. Inside, the vats were arranged in sequence: the initial soak, where hides were submerged in water and oak bark solution; the working vats, where the leather was agitated and turned; the finishing vats, where the tannins were fixed and the hides acquired their final character. Everything smelled of chemistry: the sharp bite of oak bark, the acrid bite of lime, the deeper, mustier scent of the water itself, heavy with tannins and the residue of animal matter. The hides hung on racks in the shed attached to the north side of the building, And here the smell was different, fresher, almost alive, the scent of the leather itself emerging as the processing advanced. The settlement was called Redwater, though no one quite remembered why. It sat 3 miles north, a cluster of adobe buildings arranged along a single road, a general store, a saloon, a small church, a few scattered houses. The people there regarded Hiram with the polite distance afforded to useful men. He had standing. He provided a necessary service, but he was also apart from them. The tannery kept him isolated, quite literally downwind. He came into the settlement once a month for supplies, moving through the single street with the air of a man who existed on the margins of something and had made peace with it long ago. He attended church on Easter and Christmas, sitting in the back, breathing the incense and listening to the priest speak about mercy and redemption. He did not sing. He did not speak to the other men more than necessary. He paid his debts and kept his counsel. Martha's grave was a mile behind the tannery, on a small rise where the desert had been pushed back by hand and will. She lay there in a simple wooden coffin that Hiram had made himself. A wood cross marked the spot, weather-worn now, the paint faded. He did not visit often. The tannery consumed him. But sometimes, at dusk, when the work was finished and the hides had been secured for the night and the vats covered, he would walk out to that rise and stand there in the cooling air, looking at the cross and remembering what it felt like to not be entirely alone. Those moments passed quickly. They always did. Then he would turn and walk back to the tannery and his 2 dogs and the work that never stopped. It was in the spring when the desert bloomed that Hiram had always felt most lonely. The arroyo behind his property, which usually ran dry except during the monsoons, filled with wildflowers, yellows so bright they seemed to vibrate, purples so deep they seemed to belong to the sky itself, crimsons that looked like blood spilled carelessly on the red earth. The wildflowers lasted perhaps 3 weeks, and then they faded as the heat intensified. He found beauty in them, though he would never have said so out loud. Beauty seemed like something that should matter, and he had decided, not entirely consciously, that most things did not matter very much anymore. Until he found a dying Apache warrior bleeding in the arroyo behind his property on a morning in early spring, 1880. He had gone out after dawn when the air was still cool and the light had that particular quality it had in the New Mexico spring, clear and pure, not yet beaten down by heat. He was looking for bark, for the oak trees that grew in the deeper arroyos where water persisted. It was work he did 4 times a year, and it was work he had always done alone, with Cain moving ahead of him through the rocks and desert scrub. The wildflowers were in full bloom that morning, and he moved through them without really seeing them, his mind on the vats he'd been tending, on the hide that needed to be moved from the 3rd soak to the working vat, on the endless small decisions that made up the rhythm of his days. It was Cain who found him, the old one-eyed dog, who had gone ahead, as was his habit, stopped suddenly and began to bark. Not the alert bark he used for coyotes or strangers approaching the tannery, but something different. Hiram continued forward, irritated at the interruption, and then he saw the arroyo dip before him, and in that dip, sheltered partially by an overhanging rock formation, lay a man. At first, Hiram thought he was dead. He lay too still, his dark body folded against the rust-colored earth, like something that had never moved at all. But as Hiram descended the slope, careful on the loose rocks, he saw the rise and fall of breathing, slight and labored. The man was a warrior. That much was immediately apparent. He was powerfully built, lean and muscled in a way that suggested a life of movement and exertion. His hair was long and black, matted now with sweat and something darker. He wore traditional Apache dress, a breechcloth, high moccasin boots decorated with geometric beading that spoke of time and craftsmanship. Around his neck hung a single stone, turquoise, catching the light even in the shadow of the arroyo, suspended on a cord of beaded leather. The wound was to the right thigh, and it had gone septic. This was clear even to Hiram's untrained eye. The flesh around the injury had darkened to a sickly purple, swollen and angry, and the man's skin radiated heat like a stove left burning. The warrior was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, and Hiram could see the fever in him, the fine tremor that spoke of a body at war with infection, the way his eyes moved behind closed lids in some fever dream. The flesh around the wound had already begun to darken further, the infection spreading in lines that traced the pathways of the blood, like a map of death being drawn in real time. He was also a man who would be dead by nightfall if left where he lay. Hiram knew the risk. The man was Apache. The settlement had had trouble with Apache. A rancher named Calhoun had lost cattle last year. Lost them to a dispute that had nothing to do with simple thieving, Hiram suspected, but had everything to do with land that had belonged to Apache before settlers had claimed it, and cattle that represented compensation for that loss that should never have been necessary in the first place. Calhoun had shot back. Whether he'd shot this one, Hiram didn't know. But the implication was clear enough. This warrior had a conflict with white men. Hiding him would make Hiram the enemy of those same men, the kind of enemy that burned things down and did not ask questions afterward. The choice when it came did not feel like a choice at all. Hiram thought of Martha, lying in her grave a mile away, and of how he had sat by her bedside for 3 days while the typhus ate her from the inside out, and how there was nothing he could have done but watch. He had lived 3 years with the understanding that mercy sometimes came too late, that watching someone die was worse than almost anything, worse than most pains that a man could suffer. He could not leave this man here. He carried the warrior inside anyway. The journey back took nearly 2 hours. Hiram fashioned a travois from branches and rope he kept for the tanning work, lashing a section of hide to it to create something like a carrier. Getting the unconscious man onto it required all of Hiram's strength. The warrior was heavier than he looked, solid muscle and bone, and in his fever dreams he cried out in a language Hiram did not understand. Words that sounded like commands or prayers, sharp and urgent and full of pain. Cain followed at a distance, and Abel, who had been dozing in the sun near the tannery, came to the edge of his territory and began to bark. Hiram called him off, and the younger dog retreated, uncertain in the face of this strange procession. By the time Hiram had dragged the travois to the tannery, both he and the warrior were soaked with sweat. He laid the man on a blanket in the room he kept for storage, near the back of the tannery, away from the main workspace. The storage room was small and dark, with a single high window that let in morning light. It was the most private space he had, and it was the only place where the secret might be kept for more than a few hours. It took him the better part of an hour, and the man remained mercifully unconscious through it all. Hiram laid him on a blanket in the room he kept for storage, near the back of the tannery. He brought water and cloth, and his own careful, practical intelligence to the problem of the wound. The infection had to be drained. The dead flesh had to be cut away. He worked as he would have worked on ruined leather, carefully, deliberately, without sentiment, using techniques he had learned over decades of salvaging damaged hides. He poured whiskey directly into the wound to clean it, watching the way the infection rose and pushed out like something alive, fighting back. He packed the wound with clean cloth soaked in a poultice of yarrow he foraged from the hillside behind the tannery and bound it tightly. When the warrior woke hours later, he did not scream. His eyes, dark and fierce, fixed on Hiram with a clarity that suggested he understood exactly what was happening and why, that this pain was the price of living. The next 3 days were the crisis. The fever spiked, and the warrior lay in the darkness of the storage room, delirious and calling out in a language Hiram did not know, but understood deeply. It was the language of pain and fear, and the body's rebellion against damage. Hiram sat with him through the night of the second day, listening to the warrior thrash and cry out, checking the wound every few hours to make sure the infection was draining properly. By the third dawn, the fever broke. The warrior's eyes opened with focus for the first time, and he looked directly at Hiram. Something changed in that moment. Not friendship, not quite trust, but a recognition that the man sitting beside him had chosen not to let him die. Neither of them spoke. The warrior spoke no English, or if he did, he chose not to use it. Hiram said nothing, but from that moment forward, the warrior began to eat. Hiram brought food, broth, beans, bread, and the warrior consumed it with the steady purpose of someone healing. He brought water. He changed the dressing daily, boiling cloth in a pot of water heated over the tannery fire. Knowing from his work with hides the importance of cleanliness in preventing decay. He brought herbs, what he could find, what he knew, yarrow for its healing properties, white sage for its power to ward off infection. The wound began to close. The flesh around it began to lose its angry purple tone. By the third day, the fever had broken entirely. By the second week, the warrior could sit upright, his back against the adobe wall, watching Hiram work. By the third week, with Hiram's support, he could stand, though he walked with a cane Hiram had fashioned from a piece of ash wood, working it smooth in his evenings, understanding somehow that the warrior would need this tool to reclaim his independence. This was when young Wyatt Mercer appeared at the tannery door. Wyatt was 16, the son of the shopkeeper Thomas Mercer in the settlement. He'd been apprenticed to Hiram for 6 months, coming out to the tannery 3 days a week to learn the trade. His father had hoped the boy would learn discipline and a profession. Wyatt was gangly and earnest, with the angular face of adolescence not yet settled into manhood, all elbows and knees and questions. He had a habit of arriving with a list of things he didn't understand about the tanning process, why certain hides were soaked longer, what the different colors and smells meant, how Hiram knew when a hide had been treated enough. Hiram had grown used to these questions. They came from genuine curiosity, not idleness, and he had found himself beginning to answer them more fully than he'd expected. This day, Wyatt had ridden out early in the afternoon, as was his custom. He found Hiram standing outside the tannery, looking troubled. Before Wyatt could ask what was wrong, Hiram simply gestured for him to follow, and led him to the storage room. There, on a blanket, lay the warrior. Kuzho's eyes were closed. His wound was bandaged. The space smelled of whiskey and herbs and the particular smell of infection, not the fresh stink of immediate rot, but the deeper, more insidious scent of a body fighting back against corruption. "There's an injured man here," Hiram said, and his voice was steady, without apology. "He was shot. He's Apache. If anyone in the settlement finds out he's here, they'll come with guns. I will need to ask you to either help me care for him in secret, or to forget what you've seen and go back to the settlement and say nothing. Either choice is permissible. Neither will be held against you." Wyatt looked at the warrior. He looked at Hiram. He was 16 years old, and he understood enough to know that what he said in this moment would define something about who he would become. To his credit, he did not run. He did not cry out or show fear. Instead, he nodded once, slowly, and asked what needed to be done. To his credit, Wyatt did not run. Instead, he nodded once, slowly, and asked what needed to be done. From that point on, Wyatt became part of the secret. He helped with dressings and food. He sat with the warrior during the long afternoons when Hiram was working the vats, watching the man sleep, or lie awake and stare at nothing, or grip the blanket in the fever dreams that came and went in waves. He began to understand the wound, to recognize the signs of infection improving or worsening. He learned the man's name, Kuzho, spoken in a way that made it clear this was a name with weight behind it, a name that carried authority. He watched as the warrior moved from unconsciousness to awareness, from awareness to recovery, from recovery to the beginning of strength. Wyatt, who had been thinking about joining the cavalry, about riding with the frontier troops and proving his manhood against Apache enemies, began instead to think about what he'd heard in the settlement that he'd previously accepted without question, about what land belonged to whom, about why men fought over cattle that had been stolen from people whose land had been stolen first, about whether an Apache warrior deserved to die for theft when the only theft that mattered was the theft of earth and water and a way of living. By the time 4 weeks had passed, Wyatt had begun to understand that the world was more complicated than he'd been taught, and that understanding changed him more than anything he might have learned from a cavalry uniform. By the end of 4 weeks, Kuzho could walk without the cane. During the 5th week, Kuzho ventured out of the storage room into the main workspace of the tannery. He moved carefully, favoring his right leg still, but there was strength in his movements now. Hiram was working a hide over a scraping rack when he first appeared, and both men stopped, uncertain of what should happen next. Then Kuzho gestured, and Hiram watched as the warrior picked up a scraping tool from the rack. Without asking, without speaking, Kuzho moved to the hide and began to work it, smoothly, efficiently, with the movements of someone who had been doing this work for years. His technique was different from Hiram's. He used a different angle, a different pressure, and the leather under his hands began to transform in ways that Hiram's own work had never quite achieved. The result was a hide that was softer, more pliable, more beautiful. Hiram watched for a long time without speaking. Then he understood. Apache had been working leather for centuries before Hiram was born. They had refined techniques over generations. What this young warrior was showing him was not learned in a tannery, but in a tradition that stretched back beyond memory. From that day forward, they worked in silence together. Hiram on his side of the workspace, Kuzho on his side, their hands moving over hides in a rhythm that became almost meditative. Sometimes Wyatt joined them, learning from both men, watching how their techniques differed, and beginning to understand that there were many ways to accomplish the same goal, many traditions of knowledge. The 3 of them, a white man in his 40s, an Apache warrior in his 20s, and a boy of 16, worked side by side without words, communicating through the language of their trade, the sound of tools on hide, the smell of tannins and oak bark. It was one of the few moments in Hiram's life when he felt at peace, when the work itself became a form of meditation, when the past and present seemed to exist in the same breath. Hiram knew it couldn't last. The secret would leak. The settlement was too small. And sure enough, on a morning in late spring, with wildflowers blooming across the desert floor in yellows and purples and crimsons, and the sky a clear, hard blue, a rider appeared on the road leading to the tannery. Then another, then a dozen more. The rancher Calhoun was in the lead, his face set in the expression of a man who had righteously discovered a wrong that needed correcting. Hiram was waiting in the doorway when they arrived, the smell of oak bark and lime rolling out behind him like a declaration of who and what he was. He did not move as Calhoun rode up to him. "I know you've got him," Calhoun said. His voice was not raised, which somehow made it worse. "I do," Hiram said. There was no point in denying it. "He stole cattle from my ranch." "Cattle that were taken from his people," Hiram said quietly. Calhoun's face darkened. "You putting yourself on the side of Apache now, Callaway?" "I'm putting myself on the side of not watching a man die from a wound he had no cause to carry," Hiram said. His voice remained level. He did not raise it, though his hands, hanging at his sides, were trembling slightly from the force of staying still. "He's recovering. He'll leave. That'll be the end of it." "No," Calhoun said. "He'll come to trial. He'll face justice." "Your justice," Hiram said. "Not his." Calhoun dismounted. His men, a dozen riders in all, some he recognized, some he did not, followed suit. They began moving toward the tannery door. Hiram did not step aside. He simply stood there, barrel-chested and scarred and steady, and waited. The confrontation was now physical. Calhoun was tall and lean, with the hard, wiry quality of a man who spent his life on horseback and in the sun. Hiram was shorter, but thicker, built like a stump. When Calhoun reached him, there was a moment where the two men stood facing each other, and the air between them seemed to thicken. Behind Hiram, in the tannery, Kuzho had been moved to the bark shed, the low-roofed structure attached to the tannery's north side, where oak bark was stacked in great piles to cure. Wyatt had wrapped the warrior in a blanket that bore the same color and scent as the bark itself, and hidden him deep in the stacks, where the smell of the bark masked any human scent that might have drawn the dogs. Only Hiram and Wyatt knew where he was. If Calhoun and his men searched the main tannery building, they would find nothing but hides and vats and the tools of the trade. The bark shed was separate, a place for materials, not for dwelling. It was unlikely they would search there carefully, or thoroughly enough to find a man hidden in plain sight within the piles. That was when the sound of hoofbeats reached them from the north. Everyone turned. They came over the ridge in a line that stretched nearly a quarter-mile. Apache on horseback, perhaps 30 riders, perhaps more. At the front was an older man on a tall horse, his face carved and ancient like the mountains themselves, his bearing that of someone accustomed to authority and obedience. His horse was painted with ochre in patterns that spoke of ceremony and significance. Behind him came the other riders, arranged with clear intention and discipline, moving as one organism rather than individual men. And among them, unmistakable even from a distance, was Kuzho. He sat tall on his horse, his wound healed enough to allow him to ride with pride, and his eyes, fierce, dark, alive, were fixed on Calhoun and his men. Everything stopped. The wind continued. The wildflowers continued their indifferent blooming, yellow and purple and crimson, scattered across the red earth like an offering. The blue sky continued its empty perfection, vast and indifferent. But the men, all of them, Wyatt and Apache alike, seemed to collectively hold their breath. The moment crystallized into something permanent, something that would be remembered in the settlement for generations, told and retold with different emphases and interpretations, but always returning to this single fact. When it mattered most, when the choice was between violence and restraint, the tribe had arrived, and they had arrived peacefully. The chief came forward slowly. His horse was a magnificent animal, tall and powerful, with an intelligence visible in its eyes. He approached Hiram, not Calhoun, and he stopped before the tanner. They were men of entirely different worlds, separated by language and culture and history, and yet in that moment something was said without words. The chief's face was weathered, scored with lines that suggested decades of decision-making and leadership. His eyes were dark and intelligent. He looked at Hiram for a long moment, seeing into him, understanding what the tanner had done and why. Then the chief turned and looked back at Kuzho, and something passed between them that needed no translation. Acknowledgement, gratitude, perhaps something else that Hiram could not name. The chief turned back to Hiram and nodded, just once. It was the nod of one leader to another, a gesture of respect that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. Then the chief turned his horse and began to ride back. The other riders followed in their orderly line. Kuzho was the last to turn, and as his horse moved away from the tannery, he looked back one final time, fixing Hiram with that fierce, dark gaze. Not hostile now, but full of meaning. In that look was an understanding of what had passed between them, an acknowledgement that a debt had been incurred and would be remembered. Then he turned and rode with his people over the ridge and back into the landscape from which he had come, disappearing into the desert like water disappearing into sand. Calhoun was pale beneath his sunburn. "Well," he said finally, and his voice had lost its certainty. "That's settled then." He mounted his horse. His men did the same. They rode back toward the settlement in a tighter formation than they had arrived in, speaking in low voices that Hiram could not hear. Hiram stood in the doorway long after Calhoun and his men had gone, watching the dust from their horses settle back down onto the red earth. The wildflowers around the tannery seemed to glow in the late afternoon light, and the sky above was still that impossible blue. He felt the weight of what had just happened settle into him like sediment in water. The tribe had come. Kuzho would live. Calhoun had left without violence. But the cost of all this remained unclear. That evening, after Wyatt had gone and the tannery was secured for the night, Hiram walked up the hill to Martha's grave. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that seemed too vivid to be real, oranges and purples and deep reds bleeding into indigo. He stood at the grave for a long time without speaking, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I did it, Martha. I couldn't let him die. Like I couldn't let you die, though I couldn't save you. Maybe this time, mercy was enough. Maybe this time, the cost won't be everything." He stood there as the light faded, thinking about Calhoun and what the rancher might do next. The tannery was full of flammable chemicals, spirits and oils and tanning liquids. All of it could burn in a single afternoon, consumed by flames that would spread from one vat to the next. Everything he had built, everything he had earned through 30 years of careful, painstaking work could be ash and char and memory. Was one man's life worth that? He thought he knew the answer now, but knowing and accepting were not the same thing. Wyatt emerged from inside the tannery, where he had been hidden with the knowledge and the burden of the secret weighing on his 17-year-old shoulders. His face was white with fear and something else, something like exhilaration. "They'll come back," Wyatt said. "Calhoun won't let this go." "Perhaps," Hiram said, "but not today." That evening, as Hiram was closing the tannery, a small group of Apache appeared at the edge of the property. Not warriors this time, traders carrying bundles of hides. Premium quality, treated with a skill and care that suggested intimate knowledge of the work. The chief himself was among them, and he approached Hiram with a gesture that was unmistakably an offer. The hides were a trade then, not a gift, but an exchange. Hiram understood. This was how a relationship built on mutual respect was conducted. He nodded once, and the gesture was returned. The chief said something in Apache, and one of the other men stepped forward and began to speak in halting English, explaining that the tribe was offering to continue this arrangement. Hides for goods, or payment, or whatever terms the tanner thought fair. It was a partnership being proposed, not charity being offered. Kuzho, standing apart from the group, watched the exchange with that same fierce dignity, and when the chief departed, he caught Hiram's eye for just a moment and nodded, a nod that held within it the memory of a moment in an arroyo, and the understanding that something had shifted in the world because of what a man had done when no one was watching. The next day, more Apache came. The day after that, more still. Young men on horses, elderly women with pack horses loaded with goods, traders who understood the value of what they carried. They came in the mornings and in the evenings, in groups and alone, and they all left bundles of hides, the finest leather Hiram had ever worked with, treated with methods that spoke of generations of knowledge. The hides bore the marks of Apache craftsmanship, soft beyond belief, supple, yet strong. Hiram arranged them in his workspace, marveling at the quality, understanding that he was being offered not just material, but partnership. Word spread through the settlement and beyond. The Apache were trading hides to the tanner who had sheltered one of their own. The quality was exceptional. The arrangement was profitable. Other settlers began to want access to those same hides, driving commerce and reputation, and slowly, surprisingly, something that resembled respect for what Hiram had done. Men who had previously nodded to him politely, but distantly began to visit the tannery, asking questions about the Apache hides, requesting their own supply. Hiram, maintaining his characteristic silence about the arrangement, told them simply, if they wanted the best leather in the territory, they could do business with him. He did not advertise. He did not need to. The quality spoke for itself. Calhoun never did come back with force. Perhaps he'd learned something from the show of numbers that morning. Perhaps he'd recognized something in the chief's presence that suggested any escalation would end badly for him. Whatever the reason, the moment passed. The conflict crystallized into a kind of understanding. There were boundaries now, unspoken but clear. The tannery was protected. The trading would continue. There would be no reprisal. Hiram Callaway's tannery became the most successful in the territory. The hides the Apache brought were of a quality that drew buyers from 3 settlements over. Hiram hired 2 more apprentices beyond Wyatt. He expanded the building. He even, eventually, took a second wife, a quiet woman named Eleanor, a widow with 2 grown children, who understood, without being told, what her husband had done and why, and who respected him for it. The relationship between Hiram and the Apache endured in a way that no one had expected. Kuzho became a regular visitor, bringing hides each spring and fall, standing in the yard of the tannery with that same fierce dignity, sometimes speaking words that Hiram did not understand, but understanding perfectly what was meant. The 2 men never became friends in any conventional sense. There was too much history between them, too much that could never be bridged by words. But there was a bond, a kind of wordless acknowledgement of what they had been to each other in that crucial moment, and what that moment had meant. When Hiram finally died at 72, it was Wyatt who took over the tannery. By then, Wyatt was 50 years old and had never left. He had built a life there, had married a woman from the settlement, had children of his own. He had spent his entire adult life in the tannery, learning from both Hiram and Kuzho, mastering both the European methods and the Apache techniques. He had become the finest leather worker in the territory, perhaps in the entire region. And when Hiram died and the tannery passed to him, Wyatt faced a choice of his own, whether to continue the arrangement with the Apache or to pursue other relationships, other opportunities. It took him all of 3 days to make his decision. He saddled a horse and rode north into the desert until he found the Apache settlement. And he sought out Kuzho, and he told him directly and without embellishment. The arrangement would continue exactly as Hiram had structured it. The hides would be traded. The partnership would continue. Kuzho, now middle-aged and a leader himself, brought Wyatt before the chief, and that same gesture of respect was exchanged. The nod of one man acknowledging another's commitment and character. The Apache continued to trade with Wyatt as they had with Hiram. The tannery continued to prosper. Wyatt taught his own children the craft, and he taught them both the European and Apache methods without distinction, so that they understood from childhood that there was more than one way to know something, more than one path to excellence. The story continued to unfold in the way that stories do, with consequences rippling outward across generations, reshaping the world in small but permanent ways. A single choice made by a man in his 40s became a decision that echoed across 50 years, that changed the trajectory of commerce and relationship in a corner of the frontier that was supposed to be defined by conflict and mutual destruction. This is how it works sometimes on the frontier. A man makes a choice. He is willing to pay the cost. And the cost turns out to be something entirely different from what he expected. Not ruin, but redemption. Not isolation, but connection. Not the narrow margins of survival, but something approaching grace. There is mercy in that if you know how to recognize it. Subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor so you never miss the next story. There are more like this one waiting. If this story stayed with you, leave your like, subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor, and tell us in the comments, would you have made the same choice? The Old West was full of moments like this one. Moments where an ordinary person had to decide who they actually were when it mattered. We'll be back with more of those stories, the ones the history books almost forgot to keep.